Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's webinar, Feeding Our Feathered Friends. In case Zoom hasn't been your platform of choice before, I want to make sure you know a couple things about it. When I shared my screen, it probably went full screen for you, so I definitely recommend actually exiting full screen. That will allow you to dock the chat window to the side, and you'll be able to see and participate in discussions in that way. So to open up your chat window, you're going to look for the little speech bubble icon at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and click that, and that should open up the chat window for you. One thing you want to make sure is that you are sending to everyone. So down right above where you enter your text, there should be a little drop down. If it says to panelists and attendees or to hosts and attendees, just make sure it says to everyone, essentially. Awesome. So I'm coming to you from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds and nature. My name is Kelly Schaefer, and I am with the K-12 education team, and we really package all of the incredible stuff that the lab does and make it available to educators. So basically, we create innovative resources, and deliver transformative trainings that empower educators to build young people's science skills through nature, participatory science, and inquiry. And our topic today, feeding birds, really does hit a number of these. And we'll dive into that in a little more in depth. I am joined this evening by Steph in the chat window. She is our program assistant and she will be sharing lots of links and helping flag down questions. So please feel free to chat with Steph in the chat window there. So, nature connection, participatory science, and inquiry investigations are kind of our sweet spot. Everything we create and all of our professional developments touch on one or more of these pillars. And today, bird feeding is really going to hit this nature connection piece because it's an excellent way to get to know your birds in your local habitat. But it also opens up this incredible window to dive into science learning and really bring science learning to life right out of your window. So we'll touch on a participatory science project today, and we'll also talk a little bit about how you could possibly use your feeders to inspire your kids to do their own inquiry investigations. So we're going to hit the basics of bird feeding. If you haven't done a lot of bird feeding before, there are some tools and some tips that can help you along. So we'll go through those. We'll share some free resources that you can download from our website that have lessons and activities that will help you embrace bird feeding and make the most of your bird feeders. And then we'll get into that science component, both through participatory science and through inquiry. So let's get into those bird feeding basics. So let me throw this out to you first and start with a question. Why feed birds? Why do you think people like to do it, and why are you interested in it as an educator? Kate's saying that you can see a variety of species when you feed birds. Lee's also agreeing. Helps birds with food sources during the winter. Elizabeth's mentioning that putting on a bird feeder actually brings the birds closer so you can observe them. Absolutely. About their patterns and behaviors. Yes, absolutely. When you have the birds at feeders, you're going to see all kinds of cool behaviors up close, and you'll get to observe how different species behave. You'll notice the ways that A chickadee will come and grab a seed and fly off, while a cardinal might settle in at the feeder and eat for a while. You get to know the birds around you and get to see their different behaviors. Kathleen does feeder watch and has seen some cool behaviors. Awesome. We are going to talk about feeder watch today, so please feel free to jump in with your experience when we get there, Kathleen. And then Molly's bringing up that you can see them no matter what kind of environment you live in, suburban, rural, or urban. Absolutely. That's one of the things that we love about birds. No matter where you are, there are birds, and they can be excellent teaching tools because of that. So, yes, absolutely. For us as educators and people who care about nature and birds, bird feeding is a really cool way to tap into all of these things. And as somebody else brought up, it helps the birds too, right? So you can have situations where your supplemental bird seed that you are putting out are helping birds through difficult winters. Um, in case you all aren't familiar with this species, this is the evening grosbeak, and we'll actually get to check out some feeder watch data for these birds a little later on tonight. They are very beautiful birds. Kate is mentioning that we do have a feeder watch live cam in Ontario. Yes, definitely recommend that. You will see lots of cool grosbeaks that on that cam. So yeah, bird feeding helps us and it helps birds. Sometimes I'll say that to folks and they'll express interest in bird feeding, but they'll be worried about whether they'll really see birds or they don't think there are a lot of birds around them. We call this bird blindness. And it's something that we all go through at one point or another in our lives before we open our eyes to the birds around us. And once you start looking for birds, and especially once you put out bird feeders, you'll realize that birds are all around us. And you'll open your eyes to the color and variety of birds and your students as well. And we've had lots of great anecdotal stories from educators who have taught their kids birds and having them run up to them later and be like, you wouldn't believe all the birds I see at my house. It's just a really cool opportunity to open your eyes to a group of animals that you might not always be tuned into. When it comes to bird feeding, it can be a little intimidating to start. There's so many different types of feeders out there. There's so many different types of seeds. So we're going to go through some things that you can think about when you are choosing the right seed and feeder for your area. There are a few different types of feeder pictured right here. This blue jay is on a fence post, and this would be something you might call a platform feeder, just a kind of flat open tray style feeder where birds fly up and find their food. In the upper left-hand corner, we have a tube feeder. This is another classic type of bird feeder for seeds. You can even have a nectar feeder for hummingbirds. Below that, we have pictured a suet cage. So this is the type of feeder that houses suet cakes, and suet is a type of fat that often has seeds, berries, sometimes dried insects incorporated into it, and things like woodpeckers love it, but you'll also find chickadees and titmice and wrens love suet as well. Um, and it's fun to watch them. Sometimes you'll find suet feeders that are upside down in an attempt to keep them less accessible to squirrels. So it's really fun to watch birds feeding upside down on those as well. And then you have what's called a hopper feeder, this more house-shaped feeder, which has seed that drops down into little trays that have perches along them. So there's all sorts of different feeders out there, and it can be a little intimidating to figure out how to choose the right one. Here are some real-world examples of those feeders and some different kinds of feed. We've got the hummingbird on the nectar feeder. Over in the right-hand side, we have a woodpecker with suet cakes in logs. So you'll see that sometimes as a fun way to feed suet, or you'll see people spread a type of suet that's more flexible called bark butter onto logs. You can feed even things like whole peanuts, and there are particular birds, especially blue jays, which will love those. And then your classic seed feeders. So, how do you choose the right seed preference? Thankfully, there is an interactive which can really help with that. So, I'm going to actually exit our slideshow for a moment and we're going to visit the Project Feeder Watch website, feederwatch.org. And if you go to the Learn tab, you'll see right here this Common Feeder Birds Interactive. And if we go here, we can find some tools to help us find the right seed and feeder combination for our location. So I'm going to go ahead and click View Bird List. This is going to open the interactive for us. And I want to draw your attention to the left-hand side here where you can see the type of region, the food type, and the feeder type. The region is sent to the winter region. So this is going to show you what birds you could expect to see during the winter time in these areas. The reason it is set towards the winter region is because that is the time of year that Project Feeder Watch runs. You can feed birds all year round, though. So I'm going to go ahead and let's choose a different region. Let's say, for fun, let's choose the Northwest. So we're going to choose the Northwest region and we're going to look at some different food types. We're going to leave the feeder type as all feeders, and then we're going to go ahead and cycle through some different food types. So this is the all section. So this is all birds, all feeder types, and you can get a sense for the number of birds here. Let's see how that number changes when we choose a different food type. So starting with black oil sunflower, this is kind of your all-purpose bird seed. Sunflower is a larger seed, but a lot of the small birds can still eat it, and a lot of birds really like this. So you'll notice that there's still almost that full list of birds will eat the black oil sunflower. Even your wild turkey down here will. And some of the usual suspects that you would expect to see at a feeder, like chickadees and jays, and finches and starlings, and then some that you might not always expect, or that might be a little more exciting if you watch feeders a lot, including things like pheasants around the ground below your feeder. You might get fun things like purple finches and nuthatches. Cracked corn is another seed you'll sometimes see in seed mixes. You'll notice that a lot fewer birds will eat cracked corn. Fruit is a very specialty food, so fewer birds will be attracted to that. Hulled sunflower is going to be very similar to black oil sunflower. It's going to leave less of a mess on the ground around your feeder if that's a concern at your school. I will note, however, it is a little bit more expensive. And then you can have things like mealworms and millet and milo. And millet and milo are two that you'll see often in seed mixes that you buy at the store. And sometimes it's important to note that they're not going to necessarily attract a whole lot of birds. So you might want to choose, instead of this mix that has a variety of seeds, you might want to choose just the black oil sunflower, assuming that you're just looking for the most bang for your buck. You might find that that is what is the most cost effective. And then you can also choose different type of feeders. Not every bird will feed on the ground, but once you start moving into these large hoppers or large tube feeders, you're going to start seeing that larger number of birds return. So this can just help you figure out what are your best options for the birds that you want to attract to your school. But I will recommend for schools, and if you're just going for the widest variety, simple black oil sunflower is really going to get you there. And then something like a large hopper or a large tube feeder are going to be great choices. Even a platform feeder is going to be a great choice for the style of feeder that you could use. Of course, you might be interested in trying different kinds of food, but those are just some of the most basic ones that I would recommend. So that is the Common Feeder Bird Interactive. There's lots of really great tools for you in this Learn tab. I'm also really quick going to take us over to this Tricky Bird ID section. If you do choose to do bird feeding, you might be choosing to do something like Project Feeder Watch, which we'll talk about later. That requires you to be able to identify birds to species. And Feeder Watch has these really fantastic, tricky bird IDs that help you walk through some different common birds that you might see at feeders and how to tell them apart. So one that I often hear and I know can be confusing is the downy and the hairy woodpecker. And so this has some fantastic breakdowns for illustration for you. So you've got different notes here on size, bill, and tail, for example. And if you click on each one, it's going to show you this illustration. So when it comes to the bill between the hairy and downy, you'll notice that the downy woodpecker's bill is rather short and dainty, and the hairy's bill is a lot heavier and it's a lot longer. So one of the things we say is if you were to turn the bill around and measure it against the length of the head, the downy's is only going to come a little past the eye, whereas the hairy's looks like it could almost stick out the back of the head. So remember, dainty downy and hefty hairy, and that can be a good clue. So there's just lots of tools on Feeder Watch to help you hone in on the birds you want to see, as well as figure out how to identify them. Let's jump back into our slideshow. So the next major concern is, hey, what about feeding those birds? And if I can't purchase feeders, are there options? There absolutely are. There's lots of great feeders that you can actually make. Some of these are pretty classic. You might be familiar with them. You have your classic soda bottle feeder, which you can make from recycled materials and punching holes in for perches using wooden dowels. And then you have the classic pine cone feeder, which you can make using peanut butter and seeds. And if nut allergies are a concern, something like Crisco will do the job as well. And then you can hang those out and have your own homemade feeders. You can even get a little bit more fancy and make your own seed cakes. And we actually have a blog on our website which has some suggestions on different feeders that you can make, including the seed cakes that you can hang out and make in fun different shapes. And Steph will share a link to that in the chat window for you all. There's also instructions on how to make the soda bottle style feeder in the free resource that I will mention to you, called Feathered Friends. So one of the things that people are concerned about is where should they hang their feeders? How far from a window should you place it? Because window strikes are a concern with birds. Birds can fly into windows and hurt themselves. There's actually been some research done on where the safest distance to placing your feeders from a window is. And it turns out that the safest collision zone is within 5 meters, so less than 15 feet. And that's part of that is because when birds hit windows, it's usually because they've been frightened off of the feeder and they are just kind of panicking and looking to fly somewhere quickly. If the closer the feeder is to the window, the less likely the injury is to occur or to be fatal for the bird. The deadliest collision zone is between 5 meters and 10 meters, as you can see here. And that is kind of typically where we think about placing our feeders. I would think when I grew up, most of my feeders were about 15 feet from the window. So it's just something to think about in the placement of your feeders. There are also feeders that can hang right on windows, and those are typically pretty safe too for the same reason. The bird won't have enough momentum to hurt themselves. And sometimes having the feeder on the window will help them perceive the window as well. There are often also things you can do to your windows to help mitigate bird strikes. So you can hang strings in front of them. We've recently done that at the lab, strings that are anchored on either side of the window frame. There's also like window stickers that you can place on your windows that have reflect a different spectrum of light. Birds can see ultraviolet and we cannot as people, so that makes the windows more visible for them as well. Oh yes. So Kate's asking if there are more tips about what to put or draw on windows to help prevent collisions. There is a website that came out with a study about bird populations declining that goes over 7 simple actions to help birds. And one of them is prevent window collisions. Let me see if I can find that. Steph, if you find the website before me, please feel free to share that in the chat window. They'll have some ideas and some suggestions on that website there for you. Um, let's see. So yeah, there's definitely different ways that you can approach it. Here is here's a version from our website. I think there might be a different one as well, but that'll get you started. So feeder placement as well as things that you can hang on your window can help mitigate window strikes. Some teachers have had their kids cut out like silhouettes of birds that you can place on the window that help as well. Another question we often get when we talk about feeding birds is when should we feed birds? Sometimes folks are concerned that feeding birds year round might interfere with their natural life cycle, and I'm happy to report that that's generally not the case. So there's been research done into how birds deal with feeding, and it turns out birds generally treat bird feeders as a supplemental food source. So they don't it's not their primary food source, it's just part of their diet. And it can help them get calories, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to rely on it entirely. So if you're, for example, concerned that having a bird feeder out during migration will prevent birds from migrating, that's not generally the case. You might have an injured bird that's going to stay longer and feed up more because it has that food source, and in that case, you're just helping that bird along. Birds' cues to migrate don't really have a lot directly to do with their food. Often the urge to migrate, called Zuckenruhe, is triggered actually by photoperiod, so by the length of daylight. Um, and that will help trigger this urge in them to migrate. And so providing supplemental food via feeders is not going to prevent that. And if you do feed birds during the summer, some people choose not to and choose just to do like the winter because that's typically when it's most beneficial for birds. But feeding during the summer is really fun because you'll get the adults bringing their fledglings and you can watch that behavior as well. And it's pretty fun to see the young birds sitting in a pile of seed and still begging their parents to set the seed in their mouth. So it can be still pretty fun. All right. So say you've put up your feeders and you're going along and you're having a great time. There's birds coming, and then all of a sudden there are no more birds showing up. What is going on? Well, anybody see what could be the culprit in this picture here? Shell is noticing that there's a hawk. Yeah, there's predator birds. Absolutely. We've got a hawk on the fence post, and then we've got a kestrel up on the shepherd's crook holding one of the feeders. So you might find that if you're feeding birds, you might have a bird that feeds on birds realize what's going on and come hang out. And that might mean that your feeder birds aren't hanging out anymore, or it might mean that you see some hunting happening, which, as long as your students are prepared that that can happen, can be an interesting thing to witness. But it can also be a little startling. So our suggestion is if you have a predator bird that is hanging around and your feeder birds aren't showing up anymore, take your feeders down for a week or so, and this will allow the predator birds to move on and find a different location, and then you can put out your feeders again and your regular feeder birds will come back. So you might not have a problem with the predator birds hanging around, and that's totally fine too. It's just if what you're trying to do, say you've got a study going on, you're trying to count birds for um, Project Feeder Watch or something, you might choose to do that. Of course, Project Feeder Watch would be interested in these raptors as well. Okay, so this is another culprit, the scourge of many bird feeders across the country, the gray squirrel. So you might, if you choose to feed birds, run into other critters besides birds. So you might have encounters with rodents and squirrels. And squirrels will eat you out of house and home. And some bird feeders don't mind it. Squirrels are awesome to watch. They're highly entertaining. They're cool little critters. But if they're eating all your bird seed, you might be looking for a way to prevent that. And there are some things you can do to deter squirrels. Some folks will put out a cheaper food source that squirrels like equally as well as a different part of their yard to kind of lure them away, something like cracked corn. But there's also things you can do actually at your feeder to help. So there are things called baffles, and they're these kind of cone-shaped devices that you can hang below or above feeders to help deter squirrels. So if you have your feeders on a pole, you can put a baffle on the pole, and the squirrel is going to have some challenges climbing up the pole because it can't get through the baffle. If your squirrels are coming down onto the feeders, you can hang a baffle over the feeder, and this will prevent them from accessing it. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that squirrels are excellent at jumping, and so they can pretty easily reach feeders from about 10 feet away sometimes. And this obviously conflicts a little bit with our prime window placing, so within those 15 feet of a window. So it's always a little bit of a challenge balancing the bird needs and the squirrel needs. And if you have ever fed birds before, you know that squirrels can find a way around just about anything. So this squirrel has found its way around the baffle. But if you're looking for more tips and tricks, there is a bird note all about what you can do about squirrels. And that will provide you with some more information. That is a PDF, and I think it's hosted on the Feeder Watch website. And I believe Steph has shared the link already in the chat window. So awesome. You should be able to access that. All right, so that is kind of a whirlwind overview of feeding birds. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. If you do, please feel free to use the chat window and we'll come back to them. Now I want to share with you some free resources that will help you make the most of your feeder. Today, I'm going to really focus in on one particular resource called Feathered Friends. This is available as a free download from our website. It is targeted to K through 5 educators. We've had folks adapt it up, however, but it's definitely a really fantastic way to incorporate birds into your teaching. There are 10 monthly lessons. So they are catered to different themes that are really timely throughout the year, starting in September. And they do a really fantastic job of incorporating indoor and outdoor components and helping you build up some bird ID skills while building nature, a connection to your local habitats, a nature connection, and building up to some cool science opportunities, including participatory or citizen science. You can get a sense for the different monthly themes here. So, for example, in September, we start with what makes a bird a bird. And each monthly activity has a bird of the month. There are literacy connections with suggested children's books that you can read that are related to that month's topic. There are different topics, activities under engage, explore, and inquire. So those are kind of the themes of the activities we do. And then there is a home connections piece. So there is a printout that you can send home with kids to do at their homes and with their families to extend learning that way. So here is just a glimpse of the September activities, including the home connections. So this actually home connection is from November, where we feature habitat as one of the core ideas. And in that activity, you go over the components of habitat, you map the habitat around your school and consider what components are there and what components are absent, and then have your children do those activities at home as well. Each activity has, the classics you would expect to see, this big idea of what you're trying to get at, some great learning objectives, and they are aligned to NGSS as well. So for example, September has some really fun true false games that you can play with youth that will help you gather an understanding of what your students already know about birds. There are basic statements, which you can see pictured here, that are things like birds are the only living animals that have feathers, which is true. All the way to most birds eat worms or all birds sing. And then you can get into some challenging statements, which things like bring in things like migration and whether something's warm-blooded or vertebrate for your older students. So there are ways that are built into these lessons to adapt them for different age groups. And then there's fun things like your outdoor component of this activity, which is a bird search. So getting outside and just learning to tune into birds and look for them and pay attention to them and open your eyes to the birds that are around you. Each month you get to meet a new set of birds. We try to make them adaptable for different parts of the country. So we might not, as in this case, pick out an exact species. So for example, we have chickadees. Where I am, it would be the black-capped chickadee. In Delaware, where I grew up, it would be the Carolina chickadee. In parts of the West, you're going to have the mountain chickadee. So you get to go know a group of birds, and then you can cater that to your location. And one of the great things about this is that if we go back to our overview here, you can see that in February, we work up to being a citizen or participatory scientist. And so I want to take a moment to pause and develop our understanding of what participatory science is, and then dive into a project that you can do around feeding birds, which is Project Feeder Watch, which we've mentioned several times tonight. So let's start by developing a common understanding of what participatory science is. If you've heard of participatory science, or you might have heard of it referred to under some different names like citizen science or community science, please let me know in the chat window what are some key words, ideas, definitions that come to mind, or even projects that come to mind when you hear the term participatory science. Looks like maybe it's a new for some folks. Yeah. Michelle is mentioning monitoring. Yeah, that is can be a big part of a lot of participatory science projects. Molly's saying getting people involved. Lisa's bringing up the Great Backyard Bird Count. Excellent. Yes, that is one of our participatory science projects that runs in February for 4 days around President's Day. Sharing. Absolutely. You might not need a lot of special skills to participate. That's very true. Kathleen is saying a large amount of data being submitted to scientists to increase data and analysis of trends. Fantastic. Yes, Liviana, Project Feeder Watch is a participatory science project. Awesome. So I see lots of pieces of this definition right here, and you guys are doing a fantastic job of picking out things that make participatory science exciting and awesome for us as educators. So participatory science are projects where regular folks like you, me, and our students who aren't professional scientists can go out into the natural world, make observations, collect data following basic scientific protocols, share that data with databases that scientists are using to answer real world questions. So it's kind of like helping put the pieces of a puzzle together by collecting data and sharing our observations. And I love this image to represent participatory science because there are such a wide variety of projects out there, all the way from on the scale of the universe to the scale of the microscopic, from totally online to totally outside, from global projects to really local projects, and everything in between. So I may be biased to birds, but if they aren't your thing, there are projects out there that will meet your interests. But here at the Lab of Ornithology, we really do view these participatory science projects as partnerships between volunteers and scientists. We try to make sure that you have access to the data that you help us collect. And I will show you some of these cool data tools from Project Feeder Watch in just a little bit. And like I said, if birds aren't your thing, there are projects out there for you, and scistarter.org is a great place to go to look them up. So you can investigate uh, projects based on the subject matter, the age of the people you'll be working with, whether you want it to be online or outside, and your location. And then participatory-sciences.org, or the Society for Advancing the Participatory Sciences, is a great place to go for just general information about the field. Kathleen is bringing up a great point about participating in these sorts of projects. She's saying that they also create ownership by the community and awareness of what is happening around you, and hopefully promote an impetus to conserve the environment. I think that is a great point, and that is something I love about these projects is you are answering this really essential question of why are we doing this for your students, because their data really matters and it helps them feel empowered to create um, change in their own community, to view themselves as scientists, to feel connected to the natural world. And of course, the hope is that by building these experiences and having them really do hands-on work, that you are preparing them to be more engaged in their environments and conserving them as well. Other things that make these projects great for us as educators are they help us meet our science and learning standards. So a lot of the science practices are inherent in participating in participatory science projects. And they provide us with these really fantastic, exciting, real world opportunities to study our local environment, to spark our kids' curiosity while helping them connect to their local animals. and it really helps our local birds. And for us as educators, it can also be a relatively low cost year-round activity. And as I said, it's powerful for our youth because they know their data matters. There's a reason that we are collecting this information and sharing our observations. And it's because scientists are really using these data to answer real world questions. All right. So I have said Project Feeder Watch's name a ton, but let's talk about what it actually means to participate in this project. So this is a participatory science project that runs from November to April. So we just got started and it's not too late to join. And the season will wrap up in April. And basically what you do is count birds that come to a feeding area, track your sightings, contribute them to a continent-wide data set, and help fuel scientific discoveries. There is a relatively low fee for joining Project Feeder Watch. So it's $15 fee for members of Cornell Lab of Ornithology and an $18 fee for non-members. So what you get with that fee is you get the Feeder Watch handbook that has the instructions. You get this really great poster that features common feeder birds for your area. One side is Eastern and one side is Western. So no matter where you live, you'll get birds that are relevant to you. And then let's talk a little bit about what it takes to actually participate. So, actually joining the project, by joining the project, you'll join a community of folks all across the continent who are watching birds for science. This is a map of the current year participants as they stand at the moment. So, how do you participate? Well, there's three easy steps. You choose your site, count the birds that visit, and enter your data online. What it looks like in more depth is go ahead and sign up. You can sign up during the season. Um, it can take a few weeks for your materials to sign up if you sign up during the actual season, but you can begin counting right away if you don't get even if you haven't received the printed materials yet. Step two is selecting your count site. So you want to choose a portion of your schoolyard, community center yard, or park that is easy to monitor. You want it to be something that's visible from one location. And even if the yard is bigger, you're just going to choose one portion of it that you can see from one vantage point. And even if you choose not to provide feeders, you can still count birds for feeder watch because they're interested in birds that are feeding on berry bushes and things as well too. The way Project Feeder Watch works is that you count birds on 2 consecutive days. So for each count period, you're going to select 2 consecutive days and count birds for about 15 minutes, or you can go way longer, whatever you choose. And you want to have a break between those 2 days and when you count again. So typically we say, 2 days per week, and then wait 5 days and count again. You can count less often is totally fine. So even if you were to count birds for one period of 2 consecutive days through that November to April period, your data are still valuable and you're still a Project Feeder Watch participant. I see there's a question about whether you can still sign up. As far as I know, you can sign up throughout the excuse me, you can sign up throughout the count period. You'll just have less time to count. So how do you count? Well, you watch your count site for as much or as little as you want during those 2-day count periods. And then for every species you can identify, you're going to record the maximum number of individuals visible simultaneously. So that means you want to count the max number that you see at one time. And this can be a little counterintuitive because sometimes you'll be watching a feeder and you'll see a chickadee coming in and grabbing a seed and flying off, and coming in and grabbing a seed and flying off. That bird might be the same bird. Chickadees are pretty notorious for being a bit flighty about how they like to eat. So the reason that we want to keep it to birds that you see at one time is just that helps us prevent overcounting from those multiple chickadee visits. So say you have one coming into the feeder and one in a tree and one on the ground, you would count three. The part where this can get a little confusing is birds like northern cardinals, which are sexually dimorphic. And even though you can tell them apart and you might be able to say, if you don't see them at the same time, and you could still think, oh, I've seen two, they try to keep the count protocols the same. So you would still only count the maximum numbers of individuals that you see. So you'd still only count one if you only see them separately. And then you will count those birds following those protocols, and those protocols are laid out much more clearly than I just described them in the handbook that you'll receive and on the Project Feeder Watch website. But to sum up, 2 consecutive days once a week, or even less frequently if that works for you, and count the maximum number of birds of a species that you see at one time. And then submit your counts online. And then Feeder Watch, oops, I think we went to, yeah, there we go. Feeder Watch will actually let you see this data as well. So I'm going to take us real quick to the Feeder Watch website. So we're going to go back to Feeder Watch. We'll start on the main page here. And then you can see that there's lots of different tabs up here for you to explore. The Your Data tab, you'll actually be able to enter your data here. There's also an app where you can enter your data from, and you can also look at your own data. But if you go to the Explore tab, you can see data from everybody. So you can request raw data, but where I want us to go is this trend graphs here. So for our trend graphs, we can look up a species and get a sense for that bird. So I don't know if you remembered, but earlier in the webinar, I shared an image of evening grosbeaks and said we check them out. So we're going to go ahead and look them up. Those are those gorgeous yellow and gray and tan birds that we saw. You can see a picture of the face of an evening grosbeak here. And so now we're seeing data for the evening grosbeak. Project Feeder Watch breaks it up by region and then by year. So you can see over on this left-hand map, the percentage of feeders visited at the Feeder Watch locations in that region. So these are not birds that are seen at a lot of feeders, and you'll notice they're not birds that come far south. There's hardly any reported in the southern region. That's because these are typically boreal birds, and then they will come further south in what are called eruption years. So years where there's a big population boom because there was a lot of food, and then winter comes and all of a sudden they need to go further south to find enough food. So you'll get these eruption years where you'll get them coming down much further south than they usually do. On the right-hand map, we're seeing the average flock size, so the number of birds people are reporting at one time. And you can see that these are birds that tend to flock up quite a bit. It's a lot easier to look at these data in graph form and kind of see the changes throughout years. So I wanted to explore the evening grosbeak because we know that this is a species in decline. And one of the reasons we know this is Project Feeder Watch data. So there's actually been a study published on the declines in the evening grosbeak based on Project Feeder Watch data. So these data really are being used by scientists to better understand species of conservation concern. So if we look at this percent of feeders visited, we can see a general decrease across the areas that see them frequently. If you look at average flock size, that's a little bit more stable, but you can see a decrease in some areas. And then you'll see this big spike here. If we look at the red, which is the southeast, so this is what would be an eruption year. So they usually don't have them at all. And then there's an eruption year, and all of a sudden they are having evening grosbeaks in the southern part of the country. And so that's kind of cool that you can see the eruption years showing up in the data down here. So let's compare our evening grosbeak graph to a much more common bird. Let's do a chickadee. So we're going to go ahead and select black-cap / Carolina chickadee. I think the reason they have these combined is that they fill similar niches in northern part of the country and the southern part of the country. And then there's actually an area where they kind of hybridize. So we'll go ahead and select black-cap or Carolina chickadee and hit compare. And then if we scroll down, we'll see this data by region. So we can see, let's go to, if we see the far north, you can see that the chickadees are much more consistent, while there are these eruptions again in the grosbeak. And then in the northwest here and in these is where I think you can really start to see the decline in the grosbeak compared especially to the chickadee, which stays relatively stable across the years. And then if we come down into the southwest and the central area, we'll notice some changes in the data again. Again, in the northeast, we're seeing that bit of a decline, whereas the chickadees are relatively constant. And then again, you can just see what that eruption years in the southeast look like compared to the chickadees, which are around all the time. So you can start to see some really cool things show up in your data when you explore here. So Jane is asking whether the research about the decrease in populations for the evening grosbeak also addressed the impact of domestic or feral cats. So not specifically. So I think if we go back to our slides, the paper that I was referencing is this one here. And so this is just showing the decline. And so it's just a paper that is showing there is a decline and exploring the data that they use to get there. However, in 2019, there was a big study that came out that was looking at the total number of birds in North America, specifically Canada and the United States. And it was looking at total number of birds. So not just one species, but like every single bird. If we just pile them all up in one big pile, how has that changed since 1970? And we found that in 50 years since 1970, we've lost 2.9 billion birds. So about 3 billion birds. And along in that data, we have found that we lost 9 out of 10 evening grosbeaks in that span of a human lifetime. So that is a really big decrease. And out of that research came some suggestions for how we can help birds, which were those 7 simple actions to help birds, which I mentioned earlier. Among those 7 simple actions to help birds, we've already discussed the window collisions. Another one were keeping your cats indoors. So again, this didn't specifically look at the impact on evening grosbeaks, but the impact on birds overall. And we do know that cats and feral cats are one of the leading causes of death among birds. So something like one feral cat can kill up to 200 small birds and mammals per year. So that's a huge impact just for one cat. My cat is an indoor cat. He does go outside, but only if supervised and on a leash, um, which is always an exciting experience, getting walked by a cat. So yeah, that is a big impact on our local birds, and it is something worth exploring and considering with your kids. And I definitely recommend checking out the 7 simple actions to help birds, which will have more information on that. We're going, got a little off track there. I apologize. But I do want to just make sure we take a moment of our time left to go over some of the ways you can adapt your feeders to explore science even deeper by going into inquiry investigations. So we recently put out our Students as Scientists science unit, which is all about nature-based inquiry, and it is grade banded K5 and 612. And it has some great, really just, I think, super effective lessons, all about using the science process and, even shaping scientific questions and beginning the process of observations. And one of the things you'll notice when you feed birds is your kids will get really curious and ask really fantastic questions. If you want to capture those questions and turn them into investigations, students as scientists can help. We also have Spark guides, which are associated with this science unit. These are just activities that you can do to kind of spark that curiosity and get those questions going. And one of them is a feeder design challenge. So it will use the principles of engineering and design to help you do a design challenge with your kids to create bird feeders that you could then hang out and do something like Project Feeder Watch. So you could really extend this from an engineering experience into a bird feeding experience. And then from there, you could even ask some cool questions and do an inquiry project. So this is just an example inquiry project that a student had done looking at whether birds prefer feeders on a pole or a tree. And they found from their data that the birds in their area vastly preferred the feeder in the tree. And you can even see they broke it down by species. Now, I believe this was a 7th grader. I'll have to look that up and double check there. But this one here was a study done by a combined class of first graders and kindergartners. And they were working on measuring. So they actually didn't have to identify birds to do their study. They just had to be able to count the total number of birds and measure the depth of snow. So they found that they were looking at the average number of birds that came when there was snow and how deep it was. And so this is just another type of study that you could do with a bird feeder. And you don't necessarily have to be able to identify all of the birds that come to your feeder to do a study like this one. Another popular one is like, what type of feeder do birds prefer? And you can measure preference. You could choose to do it by the variety of species that come, but if you don't want to identify birds, you could also do it by the amount of seed eaten. So there are all sorts of different ways you can use your feeder to inspire some fun investigations. So we are at time, so I don't want to hold you too much past that. But if you do have questions, please feel free to place them in the chat window and I'll get to them in just a moment. I do want to say, please keep in touch with us. Feel free to email us at k12lab@cornell.edu. There is a letter for 1 hour contact hour if you would like. Steph, I believe I shared the link with you for that. Steph will put a link for that. It's a fillable form. Just type in your name and you'll have the completion letter for this webinar. And if you have any issues with that, please feel free to email us at k12lab@cornell.edu. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to go back and scroll through some questions. Feel free to stick around if you have questions. Otherwise, I hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks so much for coming. So Michelle works with pre-K students and wondering what the easiest way to introduce bird feeding is. Great question. This could be bird feeding is great for all age groups, and I think your kids would get a lot out of it too. Um, I would consider looking at children's books as a great way to introduce bird feeding. So there are some fantastic children's books out there. And one that comes to mind is Crow Not Crow, which is about identifying birds and just by figuring out what's a crow and not's a crow, and it has a really lovely story. And it has some bird feeders in the illustrations that you could refer to and get kids excited about feeding birds. For those littlest folks, making bird feeders would be a super fun way, like the pine cone feeders, but also if you could get a window feeder, something that brings the birds really close to you, you might have some better luck with that as well. Making toilet paper binoculars is also always a super popular way to incorporate and get kids excited about watching birds. They're just so fun for the little kids. I hope those are some useful ideas. Oh, Michelle, you have to consider issues with rats. Yes, that can be a problem. Um, One thing that you could do is rake or sweep under the feeder regularly, and that can help. But another option would be if you don't have the actual ability to put out a bird feeder yourself, check out bird cams. We have a bird cam here in Ithaca, New York, that is right at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So they're New York birds, so there would be a lot that you would see in the Bronx too, or they wouldn't be terribly different than what you could see around New York. And you can learn to identify birds on the cams. So cams.allaboutbirds.org, I believe, is the website. Oh, and that is a fantastic idea from W, bringing up a bird bath. A bird bath is a great way to draw in birds. What a great idea. And then you don't have to worry about the rats. And bird baths, you'll see some really fun and wild behaviors there too. So that's a great idea. Making a bird bath today. That's awesome. I don't know if you have any green space, Michelle, but you could also consider planting some like native berry plants, something that you wouldn't have to put seed out, but you might still attract birds in with berries and things like that. Well, I'm going to hang out for a few more minutes. If you have further questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar. Thanks so much.